Okay, thank you for being here. My name is Scott McKenzie, and I am an elder in this conference, ordained in 1983 or 84, something like that, with Bishop Felton May, if anybody remembers Bishop May, Denny would. I've been doing stewardship now for over 25 years, and I talk more now about generosity than I do stewardship, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One is the word stewardship just isn't very popular. People hear the word stewardship and they automatically think, 4-week campaign in the fall, and they're going to bug me for money and all that kind of stuff. So what we want to talk about is how to really change the culture in a church in regards to generosity. You might be interested in, if you go on Amazon and if you put in a search for generosity and stewardship, you will find 7,000 books. Okay? I'm sure now there are more than 7,000. One of my partners and I, we have 2 of them now that have come out since then, so it's at least 7,002. But I know there's all kinds of things out there, and there are workshops, there are conferences all the time. And yet, here's what often happens. When I was doing one of these in the Northern Illinois Conference, we had about 300 people in the room, and before the conference, a young woman comes up to me, and she says, "Scott, I've got to tell you, I was at one of your workshops 3 or 4 months ago, and I left and I was so excited to go back into my church." But she said, "I'm back now to tell you that I'm really frustrated because nothing has changed. Nothing has changed." And I see that a lot. I see that a lot in churches. There are all the books are out there, all the speakers, all that stuff. But what's wrong? What's going on? Well, I've come to the conclusion that the issue of generosity is so big, so important, that it requires truly a complete switch, a complete change, what I call a revolution in generosity. That's what it's going to take if we're really going to initiate changes in our churches. Now, if you're going to initiate a change, if you're going to have a revolution, one of the things that you need to have is you need to have an understanding of what the big picture is. What are you fighting for? What's the purpose? And when you think about stewardship and generosity and the purpose, more often than not, it's about some kind of building campaign. It might be about how do we hire more staff, how do we do a family life center, a gym, how do you put a new roof on, remodel it, whatever it is. That is not the big picture. Because, folks, if that's the big picture, you're never going to change the culture of generosity in your church. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So what's the big picture? Well, when I wrote Generosity Rising, I thought about those words from the Declaration of Independence. And being the cheeky sort that I am, I decided, I was going to rewrite them. And this is what I came up with. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created in the image of a loving, giving, and generous God. Real life, true liberty, and eternal joy are only realized when we live lives of abundant generosity and sacrificial love. Now, folks, that's different than running a 4-week stewardship campaign, isn't it? That's different than just doing that. Now, I passed over a video, and I want you to watch this, because the big picture is really about the question why. And when I work with churches, I will always tell them the most important question when it comes to generosity and giving is not how much you're trying to raise or how much do you want me to give. And it's also not what are we spending the money on or what are we trying to raise it for. Here's the most important question.
The series is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know, the next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what. The key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So Break Time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, can you sing? And then I'm just going to show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I see.
So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose. The series is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times,
What's your why when it comes to giving and generosity? If it's all those things we've already talked about, they're going to sing like that first rendition of Amazing Grace. You know, same old, here we go. But I can't help but believe that if we really begin to believe and teach and live this, that maybe, just maybe, we can begin to sing that second rendition of Amazing Grace. When I was doing this with a large church in Clarkston, Michigan, United Methodist, and I was going to be coaching them for a year in terms of generosity, and that was after doing several campaigns with them. And I brought the leadership together basically to do something like this and just to get them on board with what we were going to do. And the pastor, who is a really, really good friend of mine, Rick Dake, Rick said to me, he said, "Now, Scott," he said, "you can have anybody in the room on your generosity team, but you can't have Sandy." Sandy was the building chair, and they were just completing a $8 million building addition to their church. He said, "You can have everybody but Sandy." I said, "Okay, it's all right." So I do my thing. At the end of it, Sandy comes up to me and says, "Scott, I've got to be on that team." I said, "You need to go talk to Rick, because he told me that I can have anybody but you, Sandy." She wrote him a 2-page letter on why she had to be on generosity. And it's because of this. Because she began to sing that second tune of Amazing Grace and was excited and fired up about it, and that's what began to happen. Now, when we talk about generosity and, in fact, stewardship, I believe the best stewardship verse in all of Scripture, it's not from Malachi, where it talks about tithing. It's not from Corinthians with God loving a cheerful giver, okay? The best stewardship scripture, in my not so humble opinion, is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave. God loved, God gave. Now, here's the question. Do you believe that you and the people in the pews, and not in the pews for that matter, do you believe that they and you are created in the image of God? Amen. I mean, and folks, that's not a Sunday school question. That's a question that you really need to ask. Do you really believe it? Because if you really believe it, then you believe that you and your people were created to be generous. That they are created to be generous. There's a guy by the name of A.J. Jacobs. A.J. Jacobs wrote a book called A Year of Living Biblically. Maybe some of you have read it. A.J. Jacobs decided that he was going to spend 12 months following all the laws of the Old Testament. And he did it from the clothes that he wore to the food that he ate. And he said in this article that I read, the hardest thing was, what do you think the hardest thing was for A.J. Jacobs? Any guesses?
Gave everything away.
What's that?
Gave everything away.
The hardest thing was the giving. It was tithing. And he says, I had to go to my wife and explain to her why all of a sudden we were going to start to give 10% away. That was a hard conversation. And it's a great, great description because he talks about how he did all the research, and as he got ready to send off his first installment of his tithe to these various charities, He describes the sweat running down his back. He describes the shaking of his fingers as he's getting ready to hit send. But then he says something happened. Something happened. He began to receive thank yous from the people that he was supporting. By the way, that's a little point that you might want to learn from, actually sending thank yous. And then he says this line, which he adapts from Chariots of Fire, where the lead character in Chariots of Fire, who's a runner, he says, as I run, I think I feel God's pleasure. He was created to run. A.J. Jacobs writes, as I gave my money away, I think I may have felt the pleasure of God. And then he adds, and that's really unusual for me to say because I'm not even sure I believe in God. And yet he felt the pleasure of God in generosity. Dennis, you've seen this before at Emmaus. One of my favorite stories captures what we've just talked about, and it's from a monastery in Tibet. And the monastery in Tibet had, as its prized possession, it had a 10-foot tall clay statue. Okay, 10-foot tall clay statue. And at some point, it had to be moved. And in the moving of it, a crack formed. And this, by the way, is a true story. You can Google it, so it's on the internet, so it has to be true. No, it really is, because my co-author, Christine Miller, she actually was in Tibet and actually got the picture you're going to see is of this. So it cracked. And the head of the monastery went out, and they're looking at their prized possession, and he begins to chip away at it. And he began to see something that glittered beneath the clay. And so he chipped away a little bit more, and that's what he found. A solid gold statue that is absolutely priceless. Now, what happened? Well, they were able to piece together what they think happened. And what they think happened was that as the marauding armies from China were preparing to invade Tibet, the monks covered their golden statue with clay in order to protect it. But sadly, all of the monks were killed, and there was no one left to tell the story. Now, if you're a preacher, that preaches. Amen. There was no one left to tell the story. And the golden statue became clay. And folks, that's the opportunity when we really take this thing called generosity seriously. You see, that's the job that we have, to really believe that your people are that golden treasure created in the image of God. But yeah, it gets covered with clay. It gets covered with clay. And that clay is usually the clay of, I call it, it's the word that begins with the letter S. And no, it's not sin, it's stuff. And boy, we really know the truth of stuff in America in 2019. It's embarrassing to say, my wife and I, we just had hardwood floors installed in our bedroom and in our basement, which meant we had to go through all of the bedrooms take everything out of the closets. I couldn't imagine all the stuff that we had. Well, stuff is what gets in the way, in my opinion, of generosity. And it starts at a young age. You know, you get, my kids, when they were young, they came to us before Christmas. And maybe you can relate to this. It was right as PlayStation was coming out, so that's been a few years, folks. And they said, Mom and Dad, I have two boys, Mom and Dad, if you buy us PlayStation, we'll never ask for anything else again. Anybody here heard that? Or maybe you've said it, okay? Maybe you've said it. And, of course, what happens? PlayStation 2 comes out. Now, we realize that it's not just kids and toys. Usually at this point, I would bring out my phone, but I left it in the car. So imagine I'm holding my iPhone in front of you, okay? You know, when I got that first flip phone, I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. How could you ever want anything else other than that? And then iPhone, I think 3, and then 4, and 5, and now what are we up to, 10 or something? And of course, you gotta have that new one. It's all about that thing called stuff. One of the questions that I think you need to begin with, if you really want to be serious about a revolution in generosity, is you begin to ask, what do you really believe about it? Do you really believe that John 3:16? Do you really believe that golden treasure? And then, does the way you do stewardship in your church, does it reflect that? Does it reflect that, or might it reflect something a little bit different? Now, every revolution needs a why. It also needs an enemy, right? You got to have, there's got to be an enemy. And the enemy, let me share you some facts on giving in the United States. Now, these are old numbers. They have not been updated. We are confident that they have not changed much over the last several years. Episcopalians give 2% to charity. Presbyterians, 1.8. Methodists, a whopping 1.6. But only 1% of that goes to you and to church. Only 1% of that. We did beat the Catholics, though. Okay, we did beat the Catholics. 1.5 and 0.8. One of the things that is a indicator of the fact that there really is an enemy is look at these numbers. Now this is if you gave $1 to charity. In 1987, out of every dollar given, 52 cents went to religion. 52 cents. That number is now at 31 cents. That's huge. That is absolutely huge. 88% of all divorces list financial-related issues as the cause. 78% of all families live paycheck to paycheck. On average, each household carries a credit card debt of $8,284, and that does not include mortgages. Okay, that's credit card. That's credit card debt. Pennsylvania has one of the highest student loan debt averages $36,000. Folks, we need to do something about generosity. We need to do something about generosity. 50% of your active attenders, think about that. Your active people, 50% give zero. 60% give less than $2 a week. When I go into a church, one of the first things I do is I'll get the entire giving list. And when I do what I call an analysis, I'll look at the current giving. And typically, in the typical United Methodist Church that I deal with, somewhere between 30 and 40% of active givers, okay, that's where it's a little bit different than this, but they've made a registered gift. 30 to 40% of those families will be giving less than $300. Active giving families. 30 to 40%. Maybe, we'll be generous and say 25%. Okay? There's an issue about generosity. There's an issue about generosity in our churches, and there's an incredible need for generosity and for doing it in a different way.
When you say active givers,
Yeah.
$300, you saying total? Are you saying that's what?
$300 a year.
A year.
A year. $300 a year. And Scripture teaches us that. There's that wonderful story from Luke chapter 12, and it's the image of the barn, and I have so much that I've got to build more barns, and on this day your life is going to be held accountable. Eat, drink, be merry. All those kinds of things.
He was the rich fool.
What's that?
He was the rich fool.
The rich fool. That's exactly right. The rich fool. One of the interesting things to ask yourself is, how do you see this quote, enemy reflected in your own life? In terms of your own giving, your own struggle maybe with debt, with stuff. It's kind of a scary place to start, but it's a good place to start. What about in your congregation as you look around you? I'll go into places, and they'll say, "Oh man, we just don't have a lot of people with money." And then you go out and look at the parking lot on a Sunday morning, right? I bet some of you can relate to that, can't you? It's an issue. Now, any questions? Any questions about what we've talked about so far? Any questions? Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just
Or comment, yeah.
I just have a comment, and it's mostly about myself. Back in 2011, we were flooded, and we had over 2 feet of water on our first floor. And obviously, we lost everything. We didn't have time to move anything. I mean, you couldn't be upset for yourself, because when you looked up and down the streets, everybody's lives were sitting on the tree lawns waiting to get picked up. And days and days and days of garbage trucks just coming and filling their loads up and going away. And when I think about it now, I think, how did I replace all this stuff? I have stuff. I mean, literally had nothing except
Yeah.
And now, I mean, you know, I look in my little curio cabinet and I have this little Fisher Price old lady with gray hair that we dug out of the mud, you know. But I have all this stuff. And now I'm at the age where I think, who's gonna take my stuff? And you know, my kids don't, they live very differently than
Yeah.
I live. You know, they don't have all that stuff. But it's amazing to me that you can have absolutely nothing, and of course, we had to live, you know, we replaced our furniture and things like that, but,
You go through something like that and you find out.
yeah, and.
You find
know,
out.
Any of the stuff that we put out on the tree lawn, you know, somebody was saying, well, I'll take your coats and I'll wash them, because we, you know, like, we had put our coats in the sunroom on the couch, and everything whipped up.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't have any coats, and, you know, people were saying, well, we can do this, well, where are you gonna wash them? We have to use water, you know, and it was like, okay, just get rid of it, and it didn't mean that much. And now I have all this stuff again, that in the end, really means nothing.
Yep.
You know, the most important things are pictures and things like that.
Yep.
But the stuff means nothing.
Yeah. Yep. Any other comments as you think about it? Because I know this is not, you know, this is not the tactics. This is not how-to. The how-to is the what. And if all you want are the how-to, just pick up one of those 7,000 books, and they'll tell you how to do it. But guess what? You'll get the same results that you've gotten in the past, for the most part, unless we begin to really change the way we think about generosity, about giving, and about who we are. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Dave.
I'm just wondering, is there a connection between generosity and hospitality? Because what I'm thinking is I just got engaged, and
Congratulations.
thank you. But my fiance is very much, let's live simple. And a lot of our people in our wedding are ministry-minded or in ministry, and we want to be able to take care of the wedding expenses for them, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
We want to be able to make the parsonage a sanctuary, and we want that sort of hospitality to be something that, I don't say we're known for, but have it be a mark, right? So when people
Yeah.
look at Dave and Lisa, they're able to be, hey,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there a connection between, I think there is, I don't know where it goes, but I think there
Well, Dave's question is great. Is there a connection between generosity and hospitality? And the answer is yes. That church I described in Michigan, Clarkston United Methodist Church, I just love them. One of their vision, it's the only church I've ever worked with, this is their vision. Their vision is to be the most radically generous church in the entire community. And one of the things, Dave, they learned after they got their building has only been up, hasn't even been up a year, okay? And it's gorgeous. Well, they had a community person came to them and wanted to use the facility for a funeral. Rick said, yes, you can do that. And the family was frankly, they really made it kind of a pain for the church, and Rick was complaining about it and complaining. And then his associate, Laura, God bless her, Laura went up to Rick and said, Rick, we're either going to be radically generous or not. We're either going to be radically generous or not. And for them, hospitality has played a huge role in their generosity. So that they have a coffee bar, and it's not a moneymaker. And they have adults that will be there at the coffee bar. One of them, she helps at the coffee bar. They've got lots and lots and lots of money, but she will just sit out there, and when the kids come up, because mom or dad are at choir practice or in a meeting and they're just there, she'll be there and give them a cup of hot chocolate and just sit down and talk with them. That's generosity and that's hospitality. And I believe with all my heart that if you really are going to be a generous people, you are going to be a people of, as Bishop Schneezy would say, radical hospitality as well. Great question. And they do go hand in hand. You know, if you've got a church that we say we're generous and then they're not willing to open their doors to anybody, frankly, typically they're not. Great one. Any other question or comments about this? Because we're gonna look at tactics, but I think we're gonna look at them in a little bit different way for you. Okay. If you're going to have a revolution, you got to have the big plan, and you got to know what you're doing, but you also do have to have tactics, and you have to have strategy. And the very first tactic, you're gonna think this is crazy.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is overglorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
That crazy video, when my partner Christine first showed that, I thought that's got to be the dumbest thing on the face of the earth. And you might be thinking that right now. But I tell you what, I've probably seen that, I don't know, I bet I've seen it 100 times. And there is huge, significant truth in that video. The first tactic or strategy that you need to be willing to address is leadership. It's leadership. Are you willing to be that lone nut? If you don't have somebody that's willing to do that, it's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. Now, one of the things that is real intriguing to consider, I've been doing, I just started a couple years ago, a new process where I'm working with clusters of churches in annual conferences. I've worked in New Jersey, Missouri, going to be working in Texas. In New Jersey, we had about 80 pastors. West Virginia had about 150. And we talked about this. And then we asked the question, we said, what is it that prevents you from being the lone nut? What prevents you from getting up and doing the dance? And we have had, when I've done this, we have had some of the most amazing conversations. When I did this at the Presbytery on Long Island, had a young woman come up to me. She was a Presbyterian pastor. And there had been a guy in the meeting. There were, 70 or 80 of them. And there was a guy in the back. He was really pretty obnoxious. You could just tell he was kind of mean. And she came up to me at the break over lunch and said, "Scott, you know that guy in the back?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "He's one of mine." And then she said this. She said, "I'm a single mom. And tithing has been a real struggle. I haven't been able to do it. But I've decided that I'm going to work my way there. And so I'm increasing by a percentage, and and I shared that from the pulpit. That's what we can do together. And I shared my story. And led by that guy in the back, the session, which is the Presbyterian version of administrative council, the session, when they met with me next, said, "You will never talk like that again from our pulpit." So do you think she's going to get up and dance? Nope. She will not be getting up and dancing. Sometimes pastors or leaders don't get up and dance because of their own personal giving. Sometimes they're embarrassed about it. Sometimes they know it's not where it should be. And I know this would shock you, but I've actually had pastors who've had spouses with drug addiction, and they had no money. They had no money left over. They couldn't give because it was all going to feed the spouse's addiction. Okay? When that kind of stuff goes on, and those may seem extreme, but we can all relate to them to a certain degree, when those kinds of things happen, then we're not willing to get up and be the leader that we need to be if we're really going to make a difference. One of the questions that you can ask is, what needs to change if I'm going to get up and dance? What needs to change if you're going to get up and dance? Now, if you're going to have this lone nut, the next thing, and remember what Derek Silver said, that really it wasn't the lone nut, it was the second and third follower, right? That's one of the things he talked about. Well, the next thing that has to happen, the next tactic, is one, your personal leadership, your willingness to get out there and dance, but secondly, it's to get the right team around you. And folks, I cannot overemphasize this point. I've been in thousands of churches, okay? I've been in thousands of meetings, and I would wager that in the majority of them, the finance, stewardship, whatever you want to call them, team is usually made up of the wrong people. It's usually one of the biggest obstacles to really growing generosity in the church. We don't have the right people. What happens when we get somebody in and they join the church and we find out they're an accountant? Well, what does that mean? What team do we automatically think they need to go on, right? Well, they're going to be our finance, person. A banker, a personal financial advisor. Those are the people we've got to have on our stewardship, finance, generosity team, right? Wrong. No, that's not. That's not who we need to have on our team. Who should you have on your team? First of all, the people you want in your team are people who have a spirituality of gratitude. You do not, please hear this, you do not want self-made men and women on your finance, stewardship, or generosity team. You don't want people who, by golly, I've done it, I've grown this business, and I've done it all. All of those old cliches, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, all that stuff. I don't want them on the team. I want people who realize that what they have is a gift. That what they have is a gift, and they have a spirituality of gratitude. Secondly, you want to have people with a history of generosity. Now, please hear me. I am not telling you you need to have the biggest givers. But you need to have people who are generous. At some point, at this point, one of the things that becomes very clear is I have a certain expectation. And the expectation is this: if you're really going to grow generosity in your church, how many of you are pastors here or going to be? Pastors, you need to know what your people give. You need to know what your people give. And in central Pennsylvania, in many of our churches, they will fight you tooth and nail for that. Okay? Some of them will fight you tooth and nail. This is just between me and God. Well, it's between you, God, the treasurer, the financial secretary, even the people who take up the offering, their tax accountant, banker. We can just go on and on and on. And what really bothers me is I have pastors who will come up to me and say, I don't want to know because I'm afraid I'm going to treat people differently, and my response is always the same: then you shouldn't be a pastor. If you can't deal with financial information, how can you be expected to deal with marital difficulties, affairs, drug addiction, alcoholism, all of the things that you deal with? What's so special about money? Okay? If you're going to recruit the right people, you have to have an idea. Now, how can you go about if your church is adamantly opposed to you knowing? Does anybody here have that? Adamantly opposed to knowing? Okay. Here are a couple of things you can do. One is, and I'm sure this is really going to work, is it's actually in the discipline now. So you can take the discipline and quote it to them, and I'm sure that will really be very, very effective. Here's what you can do: is you can begin to get the information in incremental steps, so that, for example, when one of my pastors came to me, I said, okay, we'll say it's Dave. I say, Dave, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the treasurer or the financial, whoever it is, and say, I want the I want the top 20 givers to our church. You can put them in alphabetical order and you don't have to give me amounts. But I need to know who those top 20 are. Okay? And that can be the beginning point. Okay? And what I found is once they begin to realize that they can trust you with the information, you can then begin to have full access to that. And I have some pastors who frankly just they don't give the church any choice. They say, look, it's my job, I'm the CEO of this company, and the only way I can do it is to have that information. And sometimes they're reappointed someplace else next year. So, any questions about that? One of my partners at Horizon, name is Joe Park, and Joe's from Dallas, Texas, and he just says, and he works all churches in the South. He says, well, Scott, that's not even an issue anymore, is it? Every pastor knows. And I said, Joe, come up to Central Pennsylvania. Okay, work with me up there, and because it's different. And it's different in the Northeast. Any questions about that? You gotta have good information. You gotta have good information. The people you recruit need to have a commitment to the mission and vision of the church. This is not a place where you're just going to put people on. You know, I hear that all the time. People will say, well, we're going to put so-and-so on because they're not really on board, but we think if we put them in this position, they'll get on board. No, what they will do is they will do everything in their power to get other people to join them in not being supportive. Okay, it never works. People on your generosity, and I would say finance, need to be either tithing or working towards a tithe. I don't get hung up in the whole tithing language debate. You know, people will oftentimes, okay, well, are you talking about pre-tax or post-tax? And I refuse to answer the question. I say, you know what, I don't care, because if you do either one, you're going to give more than what you're given now. And that's true. And then we'll see what God has in store for you. You know, start. And you choose. You choose. But people who are working and on their generosity, that's what you want to have. And you want to have people who are willing to give witness to the joy of giving. One of the things I've been finding, and it's really been just in the last 3 or 4 years, I'm finding the phenomenon, I've actually written about it, is I'm finding this phenomenon of angry tithers. And I don't want angry tithers either. I want people who know the joy of giving, not people who are frankly mad because they're tithing and everybody else isn't. And that's not what we want to have. We want to have people who know the joy of giving. When I was working in a large church in Baltimore, the pastor came up to me and he said, Scott, this next guy that you're going to interview, he's a business owner, he's got lots of money, and I want him to be chair of the campaign. I said, we'll see. And he comes in, interview him, and he tells me about the building on a college campus that has his name on it, okay? And then he says, and the truth is, Scott, I really am not excited about what the church is doing. I'll give a token gift of $10,000, but I'm not going to give any more than that. And so guess what? He wasn't the campaign chair because it wasn't fitting those requirements that we've talked about. Okay? Other questions about this? This is really important because when I do these, then after I do the pastor's retreat, I then begin meeting with the pastors and their generosity team. And folks, I'm going to tell you right now, when I look at the churches in those groups that I'm working with, The ones that are successful are the ones that have these kinds of people on their team. Because here's what's going to happen, especially if you're in a smaller church. You're going to have the same 2 or 3 people who always want to be on everything, and they're usually opposed to any change, but they want to be on your team. No, because they will sabotage and they will block. That's not the kind of people you want to have on your generosity team. How? So how do you go about making the ask with your team? One, you've got to gather good information, and that's what I talked about when I said you really do need to have an idea of the giving list or have access to it. And then people will say, well, Scott, okay, I've got the list, but I don't know if their gift is generous or not. And that's true, you don't. But you can certainly have a good idea, because you know the homes they live in, you know the cars they drive, you know the jobs that they have. I know, when sometimes I'll have a single mother in one of my capital campaigns. Who's going to give a gift of $3,000. And $3,000, I know, for that person is a hugely sacrificial gift. And that's important. So you want to make sure you have good information. You always want to be reminding them, what are you asking them to do? You're asking them to be on what is, in my opinion, the most important committee in the church, because of that big picture. Because of that big picture. We're about helping people become the very people God created them to be. And folks, that's stuff that matters. That is life-changing stuff. Remind people that you are not recruiting them to raise the budget, because that's what they'll automatically think. They'll think, oh, okay, you're asking me to ask people to give, and you're asking me to basically do the fall campaign. Most of the stewardship and generosity teams that I work with, you say, well, what's your job? Well, we do the fall campaign, and that's it. That's all they do. Well, that doesn't exactly fill people with confidence and inspiration to say yes. Do not ask for volunteers. Do not ask for volunteers. If you ask for volunteers, you are going to get the wrong people on your team. Frankly, I would say this for all of the positions in the church. You need to be asking people specifically to be on the generosity team. If you ask for volunteers, it will not work. Never say, don't worry, it's not a big deal. I'm guessing we've all said that at some point, where we know we've got the charge conference form and we think we've got to get these positions filled out, and so we might even dare say that to somebody, look, I just need to put your name down on this form, okay? Please do not tell somebody that it's not a big deal, because frankly, if it's not a big deal, I don't want to be involved in it, okay? And I strongly encourage you to consider going away from a stewardship committee and forming a generosity team. It is so much more positive, upbeat, and exciting to be asked to be part of a generosity team than it is the stewardship committee. I know that because I've seen it. I've seen it in action. It matters. Names matter. What we call things matter. And then remind them that they will be resourced and trained. Any questions about the how?
What do you do with reluctant people who say, no, I'm too busy, I can't do it, and you're just going to use your powers of persuasion?
Well, if I've got it, if I've got the person that I really think is the person to do the job, I'm going to sit down with them and they're going to say, oh, Scott, I'm really busy. And I'll say, okay, Bill, here's what I'm willing to do. I'll take you off of any other committee you're on. And if you'll take this, because I believe this is the most important committee for our church right now. And I would ask that, and I believe when you begin to tell people how important this is, why it's important, that's going to make a difference. And when you can say to somebody, especially, if you're starting this from scratch, in a sense, you say, look, we're going to do something new and exciting. And Bill, I need you to be a part of it for this first year. Will you join me? Will you join me? You're being the lone nut. Okay? You're being the lone nut. Will you join me and be one of my first or second followers? That's how I would do it. Now, what are some tactics? Okay, we're finally going to get down to some of the actual whats that you can do. What are some things you can be doing right now to help create a culture of generosity? One, you can do offering talks at every worship service. Every worship service, you should have an offering talk. And that offering talk can be, you can do scripture. You can have individuals tell their stories about why giving matters to them and the difference that it makes. And when you do this, you are in fact telling stories. We do a really bad job of telling stories and do a great job of giving reports. Okay? You build a habitat house, and the chair of the committee stands up and says, we just had a great weekend. We built a habitat house. We had 15 workers from the church. We spent X amount of hours. This is what we did, blah, 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 blah. You're given a report. Versus having the mother with her 2 children, maybe it's on videotape, saying thank you because you've changed my life. And then as pastor, to say, that's why we're giving money. Okay? It's an offering talk. You can take it as an opportunity to encourage gratitude, reflecting people on their abundance and blessings. When you do this, you want to encourage diversity of speakers, age, giving levels, income. It doesn't have to just be the pastor. I'll be honest, I was really surprised. The churches that I've been doing this with, when I go back and I say, so tell me what's been one of the really big things that's made a difference, I've been shocked, really genuinely surprised that several times the churches have said it's been the offering talks. Because I just didn't expect that. I didn't think that would be what they would say, but it was. It was the offering talks. This is something really simple, folks, that you can do. At the, I think at the end of the last slide I think, the very last slide is I think a Giving 365. Yes, there's a Giving 365 on the very last slide in the packet. You can go to our website and sign up for Giving 365. It's free, and it has great resources on there, and it's got sample offering talks. Okay? Everything that I'm doing up here, there are samples of. Offering talks in every worship service. Any questions about that? You can begin to engage and disciple your high capacity givers or your financial leaders. Folks, people who do analytics tell us, and I know it's true because I see the numbers, in the average church, 6% of your giving households give 40% of the money. Think about that. Don't you think just maybe you ought to pay some attention to those people? How do you do that? Take them out to lunch. Just find out, ask them what are they excited about in the life of the church? What excites them in ministry? Begin to get to know them in a different way. I just completed a campaign down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the pastor, Scott, his name was Scott, and he had never asked anybody for money. And this isn't about that, but it's similar. And he said, "Just what do I do, Scott?" And I coached him through it. I said, "This is what I want you to do." He loved it. He absolutely loved it because he was talking with people who love the church, they support the church, and he was able to kind of find out why and what their background was in it, and he said it was just so cool. So cool. Find opportunities to do that. The second thing you can do is once or twice a year, you can have a gathering. You can have it in your home, you could have it in somebody else's home. And one of the things you do is you invite these this 6% group, invite them to a home, and what do? The first thing you do is you say thank you. You say thank you. Second thing you do is you share your personal vision for ministry in the church. What's coming up? What are you excited about? And if you don't have something to share, then that's probably an issue. Give them information, good information about where the church is financially. Be transparent, be honest. And then always be willing to encourage, to challenge, and ask them to consider supporting the church in other ways or to step up. They're not going to get mad at you. I have never had anybody get angry because they were asked for money. I've had people say no, but most of them were kind of tickled that we thought that they had it to give. Okay? And they just say, "Well, I can't right now, and here's why." And they'll usually be very, very honest. And then if you do one of these gatherings, what you do is maybe you have this in your home or somebody else's home, and then right after that you have a coffee or a gathering at the church that everybody else is invited to, so that everybody's getting the same information, and you do the same thing. You do the same thing. It's the same meeting, same agenda. It's really, really simple. You'll be scared the first time you do one of these, but it'll go great. And people will tell you, they will say, "We should have done these more often." I do home gatherings in most of our campaigns, and in every church, somebody will say, why haven't we been doing these more often? Engage and disciple your high capacity givers. Questions about that? Yeah. Say that again. How do you market? How do you market that? That's a really good question. You know, some churches are used to having, some churches now are starting to do this table, they call it table talk. I'm hearing that phrase a lot, you know, where it's, hey, we're going to have a table talk conversation with our pastors, and, you know, you're going to find out a little bit more about what's going on in the church, and, you know, what's coming down the road, and there's going to be food, obviously. You do that. The other thing some of my churches have done is they've done these at the end of worship services. They say, look, we're going to take 10 minutes. Now, so it's an abbreviated one, okay? But because of the fact that oftentimes you don't get a lot of people to show up at these things, you know, they'll say, we're just going to have it at the end of worship. Going to have it at the end of worship. Not going to give a benediction. You know, we're going to move right into this. Other thing you can do, and I'm having a lot of my churches are really liking this, is they do this and you do it electronically, send it out in an email with a video of you. 5-minute, you know, 3-minute video. Obviously, it has to be abbreviated. But I'm getting much better response. My one church in Clarkston, they measure the click rate, and when they send out a straight email, it gets open 30% of the time, which is actually good. But when it's a video link, it's about 40% of the time. That's significant. That's significant. It's a good way. It's a really good way to communicate with your people.
So if you did that, like what 5 key points would you communicate on an email like that?
The 5 key points, one would be thank you. Okay, be thank you. The second thing I would do is I would say, these are some of the exciting things that are coming up. I would also, and I don't have it in here, as part of the sharing of the vision, I would also have a brief success story of, you know, this is what happened. You know, tell a story. You know, tell a story about Vacation Bible School. Tell a story about a youth that went on a mission project. And again, remember the difference between story and report. I would do that. This might or might not be important, depending on where the church is. But you can also then find out ways to say, okay, you know, you can, here are 3 or 4 different ways that you can give. Remember, we've got our online giving, we've got our kiosk, we've got the Square Reader. You know, just encourage people in different ways that they might step up. On one of these, you might choose to focus on plan giving. Part of the information, one of the tactics that you need to have is information about your giving and givers. And I'm not talking now about amounts. Here are some things you want to know. You want to know who are your first-time givers, second and third. every week, if you have anybody who gives a first-time gift, now you obviously you're not going to know if somebody throws a $5 bill on the plate, right? But if there is a recognized first gift, there needs to be a note on your desk if you're the pastor on Monday or Tuesday morning. You need to know that so that you can then send a thank you. On that Giving 365, we have a whole thing on first-time giver strategies. That is huge because they are testing the water. That first gift, they are testing the water. I guarantee you, they make that first-time gift to a local charity, they're going to get a thank you note. They might even get a phone call right away. We need to be more and more active. And when people begin to make the second and then especially a third time gift, now they're ready to consider being invested more in the life of the church. And it's at that point where I would have a conversation with them about what would you like to do? What kind of small group would you like to get involved in? That's the point when that begins to be really, really a helpful conversation. Typically, you don't want to do that at the first gift. But to do that at the third, because now they're saying, we're ready to go deeper. We're ready to go deeper. And then one of the last pieces I want you to be able to be aware of is who are your givers that have stopped giving or they've lowered their giving. Finances are often one of the first ways that you can know whether or not somebody's considering dropping out. And we need to pay attention to it. John Savage, who this was 30, 40 years ago, did some of the first work and research on inactive members and what he called the dropout track. You have 6 weeks. You have 6 weeks. When somebody starts to drop out, you have 6 weeks in order to go reclaim them. Is there something going on? Tornado warning. I guess we're in the basement, so I guess that's good. We have no windows. If you all have to go do something, okay. I figured that was probably the case. Everybody started looking at their phones. But lapsed givers, folks, that's a real important piece in terms of knowing that, and if they've backed off. Any questions about that? Enhanced giving statements. Giving statements are one of the most underutilized pieces of communication in church life. How many do these quarterly? Okay, that's the first thing we got to change. Okay? These statements should go out quarterly. Are many of you just doing year end? They don't do anything. Quarterly, here's why quarterly is important, and I've seen this, and I've had people tell me this. When they get it just once a year or even every 6 months, when they get behind, they're already so far behind that they just give up. But a quarterly statement, they can say, okay, yep, man, I missed, I forgot, whatever, and it's easier to get back on track. Okay, so quarterly is important. Now, I've seen a lot of statements in my life, and most of them are, it just looks like a business, thing that says, we have recorded X amount perhaps as a pledge, and here's what you've paid year to date, and basically that's kind of it. And it's really almost a waste of time and effort. The church, and I've seen churches that are doing this, what they've done is they've enhanced their giving statements, and they always will have some kind of a story about what's gone on in the last 3 or 4 months. They'll give out information about where the church is financially. Always say thank you. They then give individual giving information, and again, the idea of what's next, what's coming down the road. Maybe it's Vacation Bible School. Maybe it's, a new Bible study that's being formed, whatever. But this becomes an opportunity to communicate with your people. It really is underutilized. I strongly encourage you to find a way to do something like this. Any questions about that? Do you do tax? Really?
Yeah. I actually want to ask you, this is way too complicated to ask for the whole group, but
Okay.
some different things about
Yeah, okay. Now, when I say quarterly, send 5 times a year, and I know that's not quarterly, but you do the quarterly plus, excuse me, the quarterly plus one in November. Why? Because the one in November becomes a reminder about year-end giving. You have a lot of people in your churches who are over the age of 70 and a half, correct? Have you ever heard of something called the required minimum distribution for IRAs? You got a whole bunch of people in your church who at the age of 70 and a half can take their required minimum distribution, they can give that to the church, and they get a huge tax benefit. And churches need to be putting that in things like that year-end statement and reminding people. And they will be grateful because it will make a difference. You have people who will be getting year-end bonuses. Well, it's a great time to make that over and above gift for folks. Remind folks about stock. Giving stock. I now have a lot, not a lot, but I have people who their entire gift is stock. And don't think that these are just rich people. You got a lot of little old ladies, the proverbial little old lady that whose husband left her lots of shares of a local bank stock, and she may not even know how much it's worth. And again, that's a way that you can help. Tell stories, and tell them again. The one thing that I believe will make the biggest difference is you tell stories of changed lives. I do, in almost all my campaigns, I do something called cardboard testimonies. Have you done cardboard testimonies or seen them done? They are so cool. And, I had, when this church in Sarasota, Florida did it, and everybody in the audience was over the age of 65. Everybody. And I was actually there in church that day, and this little old lady, proverbial little old lady, she had the pillbox hat on, she had the gloves, the whole thing, okay? And they did this thing called cardboard testimonies where people talk about, something they've struggled with, and it's written on a piece of cardboard, something they've struggled with, and then you flip it over, and it's how God or the church has blessed them and helped them. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. Well, the last person to do her cardboard testimony was the pastor's administrative assistant. She was beloved. And she had been in an accident. A truck hit her car, and she was severely injured. And she stood up there, and she held it up, and she said, a truck injured, almost ruined my life, whatever. And then she flips it over, and it says, God sent me back to serve you. And that congregation, in one accord, stood up and gave a standing ovation. And after the service, this proverbial little old lady, she yanked on my shirt sleeve. She was behind me. She said to me, "Are you in charge of this?" And I said, "No, ma'am, he is." I pointed at the preacher. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I wanted you to know that I'm 80-some years old, and I was brought to this church as a baby, and I've been here ever since, and that was the most meaningful worship service I have ever been a part of." Tell stories. Tell stories. One of the things you can do to tell stories is when you have administrative council meetings, and folks, when you start off doing this, there's going to be silence. But every administrative leadership, whatever you call, you ask, what stories? What's happening? Okay, and like I said, there's going to be silence. But keep at it. Keep at it. If you have staff, if you have youth workers, if you have anybody else, when you have staff meeting, this is when you tell stories. And then that becomes part of the fodder for using those stories in worship. It will be one of the best things you can do to create a culture of generosity. Any questions, folks? That's what I've got for you. Thank you for being here. That last slide, and I think I've got. The Giving 365. If you go down and you sign up here, it really is very, very good stuff. Offering talks and other helps. Okay, I am going to have somewhere. I'm going to have a table with, and it'll have a Horizons banner on it. There'll be 3 or 4 stacks of books. They're free, so you can stop by and grab one. You can also grab a business card of mine if you'd like to. Folks, I talk a lot with people on phones, and I don't charge. If you just have a question and want to bounce something off me, give me a call. It's what I do. There's my cell number and my email. It's on that. Again, it's on that last slide. Anything else? Okay, thank you, and folks, be safe. Be safe, okay?